Hey guys, tonight we're exploring why you absolutely wouldn't survive a single day working as a medieval blacksmith. A job that combined the worst aspects of extreme athletics, industrial accidents, and working inside a literal oven for 16 hours straight. From starting work at 4 a.m. in temperatures that would make modern construction workers quit immediately, to developing the kind of muscle mass that required eating 6,000 calories a day just to maintain, this is the story of humanity's most punishing profession. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval blacksmithing was essentially a full-contact sport that lasted all day, every day, while working next to fires hot enough to melt copper and wielding hammers that weighed more than modern bowling balls. The average blacksmith shop maintained internal temperatures between 90 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit even in winter, while the forge itself burned at over 2,000 degrees, creating working conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety regulation ever written. Your workday would begin at 4 a.m., not because medieval people were early risers by choice, but because blacksmiths needed to get the forge fires burning hot enough for metalworking before customers started arriving at dawn. This meant stumbling around in complete darkness, building fires from scratch using flint, steel, and tinder that took 30 minutes of careful work just to create the first flames. The coal preparation alone would exhaust most modern people before the actual metal work even began. Medieval blacksmiths used charcoal that they often had to make themselves, requiring hours of splitting wood, stacking it in precise patterns, and tending slow-burning fires that converted wood into the high-carbon fuel needed for metalworking. Getting the coals to the right temperature required constant attention, bellows work, and intuitive understanding of fire behavior that took years to develop. The bellows operation was a full-body workout that modern gym equipment couldn't replicate. Medieval bellows were massive leather contraptions that required steady, rhythmic pumping to maintain airflow that kept forge fires at working temperature. One person typically spent their entire day just operating bellows, developing the kind of cardiovascular endurance and upper body strength that would impress modern athletes. The hammer work would destroy your shoulders, elbows, and back within hours of starting. Medieval smiths used hammers ranging from 2 to 8 pounds that they swung thousands of times per day with precision and power that shaped red-hot metal into useful objects. The technique required perfect timing, as striking too early or too late could ruin hours of work or cause dangerous metal fragments to fly in unpredictable directions. The heat exposure would cause immediate dehydration and heat exhaustion in anyone not gradually conditioned to forge work. Blacksmiths regularly worked within 3 feet of fires burning at temperatures that could melt bronze, while wearing leather aprons and wool clothing that provided protection from sparks but trapped heat body like medieval insulation. Staying hydrated required drinking gallons of water and weak beer throughout the day. The constant exposure to smoke, coal dust, and metal particles would trigger immediate respiratory problems in modern people unaccustomed to polluted air. Medieval blacksmith shops filled with thick, acrid smoke that blackened walls, lungs, and everything else in the workspace. Long-term exposure caused chronic coughing, breathing difficulties, and lung diseases that shortened lifespans significantly compared to other medieval occupations. The burn risks were constant and inevitable, with even experienced smiths collecting scars from hot metal splashes, accidental contact with heated surfaces, and sparks that ignited clothing or found gaps in protective gear. First and second degree burns were routine occupational hazards that had to be treated with medieval remedies like honey, herbs, and prayer rather than modern medical care. The noise levels would cause permanent hearing damage within weeks of starting blacksmith work. The constant ringing of hammer on anvil, combined with the roar of forge fires and the creaking of bellows, created sound levels that exceeded modern workplace safety limits by significant margins. Medieval smiths developed partial hearing loss as a normal part of their profession. The muscle development required for blacksmith work was extreme, even by medieval standards, with successful smiths developing asymmetrical physiques that reflected the specific motions and stresses of their craft. The dominant arm and shoulder became significantly larger and stronger than the non-dominant side, while the back muscles developed to support constant bending over anvils and lifting heavy metal objects. The caloric requirements for maintaining this level of physical activity meant consuming between 4,000 and 6,000 calories daily, far more than medieval diets typically provided. Blacksmiths had to eat constantly throughout their workday, consuming bread, cheese, meat, and beer in quantities that would be considered excessive by modern nutritional standards, but were necessary to fuel the extreme physical demands of forge work.
And this was just the physical foundation required to survive medieval blacksmithing work. The apprenticeship required to become a competent blacksmith was a 7-year commitment that made modern professional training look like a weekend workshop. Apprentices started around age 12 and spent their teenage years performing the most dangerous and exhausting tasks while learning skills that required perfect coordination between eyes, hands, and timing that could only be developed through thousands of hours of practice with red-hot metal and heavy tools. The first year was spent entirely on fire management and tool maintenance, tasks that seem simple until you realize that medieval forges were temperamental beasts that required constant adjustment to maintain working temperatures. Apprentices learned to read fire colors, adjust airflow, and manage coal consumption while developing the stamina needed for 12-hour days of physical labor in extreme heat. Learning to operate the bellows correctly took months of practice to develop the rhythm and strength needed for consistent performance. The timing had to be perfect, as irregular airflow could ruin metalwork in progress or cause dangerous temperature fluctuations that might crack the forge structure itself. Apprentices developed specific breathing patterns and muscle memory that allowed them to maintain bellows operation for hours without breaking rhythm. Tool maintenance was a complex skill that required understanding metallurgy principles that weren't formally documented, but had to be learned through observation and trial and error. Keeping hammers, Tongs and other tools in proper condition required regular reshaping, sharpening, and replacement that apprentices had to master before being trusted with actual metalworking projects. The first metalworking attempts resulted in spectacular failures that wasted expensive materials and created safety hazards, while learning to judge metal temperature by color alone took years of practice, as overheated metal became brittle and dangerous, while underheated metal couldn't be shaped properly. Beginning smiths ruined countless pieces of iron and steel while developing the visual judgment needed for successful metalwork. Hammer technique required precise coordination between dominant and non-dominant hands while working with red-hot metal that had to be shaped within narrow temperature windows before cooling and hardening. The timing, angle, and force of each hammer blow had to be perfect, as mistakes could send metal fragments flying or create stress fractures that would cause tools to fail catastrophically during use. Learning to work with different metals required understanding the unique properties of iron, steel, bronze, and other alloys that behaved differently at various temperatures and required specific techniques for successful shaping. Each metal had its own working characteristics, heat treatment requirements, and failure modes that apprentices learned through expensive mistakes and patient instruction from masters who had made the same errors decades earlier. The mathematical skills required for blacksmith work included geometry, proportional reasoning, and measurement techniques that had to be learned without formal education or written reference materials. Creating tools and hardware required precise calculations about thickness, length, and stress distribution that apprentices learned through practical application rather than theoretical instruction. Quality control standards were unforgiving, as defective metalwork could cause serious injuries or property damage when tools failed during use. Apprentices learned to inspect their work for hidden flaws, stress concentrations, and structural weaknesses that might not be apparent until the finished product was subjected to real-world stresses that revealed manufacturing defects. The social hierarchy within blacksmith shops was rigid and often harsh, with apprentices expected to accept criticism, physical correction, and demanding work assignments without complaint. Mastersmiths had absolute authority over apprentices and could extend training periods, refuse advancement, or dismiss apprentices who didn't meet exacting standards for skill development and professional behavior. Time management skills had to be developed to coordinate multiple projects at different stages of completion, since forge work required careful timing to heat treat metals properly while maintaining productivity levels that kept customers satisfied and businesses profitable. Apprentices learned to juggle competing priorities while maintaining quality standards that couldn't be compromised for the sake of speed or convenience. Customer interaction required diplomatic skills and technical knowledge that allowed apprentices to explain complex metalworking processes to clients who might not understand the time and effort required for quality work. Managing expectations while delivering products that met specifications required communication abilities that weren't taught formally, but had to be developed through experience. The economic realities of blacksmith training meant working for minimal wages while learning skills that took years to develop into profitable expertise. Apprentices typically received room, board, and basic clothing in exchange for their labor, but had to wait years before earning wages that could support independent living or starting their own businesses. Advancement to journeyman status required demonstrating mastery of core blacksmithing skills through practical examinations that tested both technical ability and work efficiency under realistic production conditions.
The daily operational hazards in a medieval blacksmith shop would trigger immediate workplace safety shutdowns under modern regulations, with risks that included fire, explosion, toxic fumes, heavy machinery accidents, and exposure to temperatures that could cause third-degree burns within seconds of contact. Every single task involved multiple ways to be seriously injured or killed. Fire management required constant vigilance to prevent forge fires from spreading to wooden buildings, stored materials, or clothing that could ignite from stray sparks or radiant heat. Medieval buildings were essentially fire traps constructed from timber, thatch, and other flammable materials that could burn completely within minutes once ignited. Blacksmith shops were frequent sources of devastating fires that destroyed entire neighborhoods. Coal gas poisoning was a constant threat in poorly ventilated workshops, where carbon monoxide accumulated to dangerous levels without any warning systems or detection equipment. Smiths working in enclosed spaces during winter months regularly suffered from headaches, dizziness, and respiratory problems that could progress to unconsciousness and death if exposure levels became too high. Hot metal handling required protective equipment that was primitive and often inadequate for the temperatures involved. Leather gloves and aprons provided some protection from sparks and brief contact with heated surfaces, but couldn't prevent serious burns from direct contact with metal at forging temperatures. Tongs and other handling tools frequently slipped or broke, dropping red-hot metal onto feet, legs, and work surfaces. Quenching operations involved plunging superheated metal into water or oil, creating violent steam explosions and splashing that could cause severe burns over large areas of exposed skin. The rapid temperature changes also created stress fractures and metal failures that sent sharp fragments flying at high velocity. Proper quenching technique required experience and timing that could only be learned through dangerous trial and error practice. Anvil work subjected smiths to repetitive stress injuries and acute trauma from missed hammer blows that struck hands, fingers, or the anvil surface with enough force to break bones or cause permanent disability. The rebound from striking hardened steel could send hammers flying unpredictably, creating hazards for anyone working nearby. Proper anvil technique required years of practice to develop safe and effective working methods.
Sharp edge creation for tools and weapons involved grinding, filing, and polishing operations that created metal dust,
sharp particles, and cutting hazards that could cause severe lacerations or eye injuries. The grinding wheels and files used for edge work were primitive by modern standards and frequently broke or became damaged during use, creating sudden hazards that required immediate response to prevent serious injury. Heavy lifting operations required moving iron stock, finished products, and equipment that often weighed hundreds of pounds using only human muscle power and simple mechanical aids like levers and pulleys. Back injuries, hernias, and crushing accidents were common occupational hazards that could end careers immediately and permanently disable workers who had no access to modern medical treatment or disability support. Chemical exposure from flux materials, cleaning solutions, and metal treatments created skin irritation, respiratory problems, and long-term health issues that weren't understood or recognized as occupational diseases. Medieval smiths regularly worked with substances that modern safety protocols classify as hazardous materials, requiring specialized handling and protective equipment that didn't exist in medieval times. Equipment failures were frequent and dangerous, as medieval tools and machinery lacked the safety features and reliability standards expected in modern workplaces. Hammerheads flew off handles, tongs broke under stress, and forge structures cracked or collapsed without warning, creating sudden emergencies that required immediate response to prevent catastrophic accidents. Workspace organization in medieval blacksmith shops created constant tripping and collision hazards, with tools, materials, and work surfaces arranged according to practical necessity rather than safety considerations. Poor lighting from fires and candles created blind spots and shadows that made it easy to walk into hot surfaces, sharp edges, or heavy objects. Emergency response capabilities were non-existent by modern standards, with no first aid equipment, emergency medical services, or systematic safety procedures for dealing with injuries, fires, or other workplace emergencies. Serious accidents often resulted in permanent disability or death simply because effective medical treatment wasn't available when needed most.
The business pressures facing medieval blacksmiths would crush modern entrepreneurs who are accustomed to stable supply chains, predictable costs, and legal protections for business operations. Medieval smiths operated in an economy where raw materials were scarce and expensive. Customers could refuse payment for finished work, and competition was regulated by guilds that controlled access to markets through political connections rather than merit or efficiency. Iron procurement required establishing relationships with miners, transporters, and merchants who controlled access to raw materials that were essential for blacksmith operations, but subject to price fluctuations, quality variations, and supply disruptions that could shut down businesses without warning. Medieval iron was often of poor quality and required extensive processing to remove impurities that made metalworking more difficult and time-consuming. Tool investment represented enormous startup costs that required years of savings or borrowing at high interest rates from moneylenders who could seize property and equipment if payments fell behind schedule. A complete set of blacksmith tools and equipment could cost more than a house, making business entry extremely difficult for anyone without family connections or wealthy patrons willing to provide financial backing. Guild membership was mandatory for practicing blacksmith trades in most medieval towns, but guild admission required political connections, substantial fees, and demonstration of skills that were judged by competitors who had economic incentives to limit new entrants to their markets. Guild politics could make or break blacksmith careers, regardless of individual skill or work quality. Customer relations were complicated by payment systems that often involved bartering goods and services rather than money, creating valuation disputes and collection problems that modern businesses avoid through standardized pricing and legal contract. Medieval customers might pay for metalwork with grain, livestock, or labor that wasn't always equivalent in value to the time and materials invested in finished products. Quality expectations from customers were extremely high, despite their reluctance to pay premium prices, as defective metalwork could cause serious accidents or property damage that would be blamed on the smith, regardless of how the tools were used or maintained after delivery. Reputation damage from a single failure could destroy years of careful business building and customer relationship development. Seasonal demand fluctuations created feast or famine business cycles that made financial planning nearly impossible, with agricultural seasons driving demand for farming tools, while military conflicts created sudden demand for weapons and armor that had to be met immediately, regardless of existing production schedules or material availability. Competition from other smiths and imported goods created constant pressure to reduce prices while maintaining quality standards that required expensive materials and time-intensive production methods. Medieval markets were small and local, meaning that losing even a few customers could threaten business viability and force smiths to relocate or change professions entirely. Legal protections for business operations were minimal and inconsistent, with local authorities more concerned with collecting taxes and maintaining political stability than protecting individual business interests or enforcing contracts between merchants and customers. Disputes were settled through personal negotiation or local courts that might favor politically connected parties regardless of legal merit. Retirement planning was non-existent for medieval blacksmiths, whose physical capabilities declined with age and injury, but who had no pension systems or social safety nets to support them when they could no longer perform heavy physical labor. Most smiths worked until disability or death ended their careers. As we settle into our modern beds with ergonomic furniture and climate control, there's something both humbling and terrifying about imagining a single day in a medieval forge where every task involved mortal danger and physical demands that would hospitalize most modern people within hours of starting work. Tomorrow, when we sit at comfortable desks with safety regulations protecting us from workplace hazards and modern medicine available for any injuries, we can appreciate both our technological advantages and the remarkable determination of medieval craftspeople who built civilization through daily acts of incredible physical courage and skill that most of us couldn't match even with modern training and equipment.
Hey guys, tonight we're exploring why medieval blacksmith shops were essentially fire bombs waiting to explode. Workplaces so dangerous that entire neighborhoods lived in constant fear of the next blacksmith-related inferno that could destroy hundreds of buildings in a single afternoon. From wooden structures filled with flammable materials surrounding 2,000-degree forges to safety protocols that consisted entirely of hope it doesn't happen, this is the story of medieval fire prevention that made gasoline storage facilities look like safety training centers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval blacksmith shops were constructed like purpose-built fire hazards that combined every possible combustible material with the hottest industrial process available in the medieval world. The typical blacksmith workshop was a wooden building with a thatched roof, wooden floors, wooden workbenches, and wooden storage areas filled with charcoal, coal, oil, and various flammable chemicals, all surrounding a forge that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 to 16 hours every single day. The building materials used in medieval construction were essentially fire starter kits waiting for ignition. Timber framing created structural elements that could burn completely through in less than an hour once ignited, while thatched roofs made from dried straw, reeds, or rushes provided perfect kindling that could spread flames to neighboring buildings faster than people could organize firefighting efforts. Forge construction placed the hottest part of the operation directly against combustible building materials with minimal protection or isolation. Medieval forges were typically built into stone or brick hearths, but the surrounding wooden structures were often only inches away from surfaces that regularly reached several hundred degrees. The radiant heat from forge operations gradually dried out nearby wood until it became extremely flammable tinder that could ignite from a single spark or ember. Chimney systems were primitive and often inadequate for the volume and intensity of smoke and sparks produced by forge operations. Many blacksmith shops relied on simple holes in the roof or crude stone chimneys that allowed hot gases and burning particles to escape directly into combustible roofing materials. These chimney systems frequently developed cracks or structural problems that created additional fire risks. Ventilation requirements for forge work created openings and air currents that could spread fires rapidly once ignition occurred. Blacksmith shops needed constant airflow to maintain forge temperatures and clear smoke, but these same air currents provided oxygen that fed fires and carried sparks and burning materials to new areas of the workshop and neighboring buildings.
Storage practices in medieval blacksmith shops concentrated maximum amounts of flammable materials in minimum space without any fire separation or containment systems. Charcoal, coal, oil, tallow, and various combustible chemicals were typically stored in the same room as the forge operations, creating fuel loads that could sustain intense fires for hours once ignition occurred. Lighting systems added additional fire hazards through open flame sources that were necessary for work that often continued after dark. Candles, oil lamps, and torches provided illumination, but also created ignition sources that could start fires if knocked over, left unattended, or brought too close to flammable materials during normal work activities. The absence of fire detection and suppression systems meant that fires could develop and spread extensively before anyone noticed the problem. Medieval blacksmith shops had no smoke alarms, sprinkler systems, or fire extinguishers, relying entirely on human observation and manual firefighting methods that were often ineffective once fires gained momentum in combustible building materials. Water access for firefighting was limited and often inadequate for the intensity and speed of blacksmith shop fires. Most medieval towns depended on wells, streams, or cisterns that provided limited water supplies that could be quickly exhausted during major fire emergencies. Transporting water to fire scenes using buckets and other primitive methods was time-consuming and inefficient compared to the rapid spread of fires in combustible buildings. Weather conditions significantly affected fire risks, with dry periods creating extreme hazards when building materials and stored combustibles became desiccated and highly flammable. Drought conditions could turn entire neighborhoods into fire traps, where a single spark from a blacksmith forge could ignite fires that spread for miles before burning themselves out or reaching natural fire breaks.
Wind patterns could transform minor forge incidents into catastrophic conflagrations that destroyed entire communities within hours of initial ignition. Strong winds carried sparks and burning debris across long distances, while providing oxygen that intensified fires beyond the capacity of medieval firefighting methods.
Daily operational procedures in medieval blacksmith shops involved dozens of activities that created fire hazards, each one a potential ignition source that could trigger workshop fires or spread flames to surrounding buildings. Every routine task, from lighting the forge to cleaning up at the end of the day, involved handling open flames, hot materials, and combustible substances under conditions that would violate modern fire safety regulations. Morning forge lighting required building fires from scratch using flint, steel, tinder, and kindling that had to be carefully ranged and tended until stable combustion was established. This process involved open flames near stored combustible materials, while smiths worked in dim lighting conditions that made it difficult to notice stray sparks or small fires that could develop into major conflagrations. Coal and charcoal handling created constant fire risks through spillage, dust generation, and storage practices that concentrated combustible materials throughout the workshop. Medieval smiths typically stored fuel supplies in wooden boxes, baskets, and bins that were themselves flammable and often placed close to forge operations where sparks and radiant heat could cause ignition without immediate detection. Bellows operation generated air currents that carried sparks, embers, and hot particles throughout the workshop while providing oxygen that intensified any fires that started. The bellows themselves were flammable and could ignite if sparks landed on them or if they were positioned too close to the forge fire during intensive heating operations. Hot metal handling involved moving pieces heated to 1800 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit using primitive tools that frequently failed or were dropped, sending red-hot metal fragments onto wooden floors, workbenches, and stored materials. These superheated metal pieces could ignite virtually any combustible material on contact and were difficult to locate and extinguish once they fell into storage areas or under equipment. Quenching operations created steam explosions and violent splashing that could scatter hot water, oil, and metal particles across the workshop while generating clouds of steam that reduced visibility and made it difficult to monitor for fire development. The quenching tanks themselves often contained flammable oils that could ignite from contact with superheated metal or nearby sparks. Grinding and filing operations generated streams of hot metal sparks that traveled considerable distances before cooling and could ignite combustible materials throughout the workshop. These sparks were numerous, difficult to control, and hot enough to start fires in dry wood, cloth, straw, and other common materials found in medieval blacksmith shops. Tool heating and heat treatment required precise temperature control that often involved overheating metal beyond safe working temperatures, creating extreme fire hazards when superheated tools came into contact with combustible materials or were accidentally dropped. The color-based temperature judgment used by medieval smiths was imprecise and frequently resulted in overheating that created dangerous fire risks. Chemical treatments used for cleaning, etching, and finishing metalwork involved acids, oils, and other substances that were often flammable or created flammable vapors that could ignite explosively from contact with forge fires or sparks. These chemicals were typically stored in the same workshop areas as forge operations without proper separation or ventilation. Waste disposal practices created accumulating fire hazards as metal shavings, coal dust, oil-soaked rags, and other combustible waste materials were allowed to accumulate in workshop areas where they could be ignited by sparks or hot metal fragments. Medieval blacksmith shops rarely had systematic waste removal procedures that would reduce fire risks. Evening shutdown procedures involved banking forge fires for overnight burning, a practice that maintained heat for next-day operations but created continuous fire hazards during unattended hours when small problems could develop into major fires without immediate detection or response. These banked fires required careful management to prevent overheating or spreading beyond the forge structure. Maintenance activities on forge structures, chimneys, and bellows systems often disturbed protective materials and created temporary fire hazards while repairs were completed. Cleaning accumulated soot and debris from chimneys could dislodge burning materials, while structural repairs might expose combustible building materials to increased heat and spark exposure. Customer interactions brought additional fire risks when clients brought flammable materials, observed hot metal work, or interfered with normal safety procedures through unfamiliarity with forge hazards. Visitors to blacksmith shops often wore loose clothing, carried combustible items, or positioned themselves in dangerous locations where they could be injured by sparks or accidentally cause fires through inappropriate behavior. Apprentice supervision was crucial for fire prevention, but often inadequate during busy periods when experienced smiths were focused on complex work and unable to monitor inexperienced workers who might make fire-causing mistakes.
When fires started in medieval blacksmith shops, they typically developed and spread faster than anyone could respond effectively, turning minor incidents into major disasters within minutes due to the concentration of combustible materials and the absence of effective fire suppression systems. The combination of intense heat sources, flammable building materials, and primitive firefighting capabilities created perfect conditions for catastrophic fires. Initial fire development usually began with small ignitions that went unnoticed until they had already spread beyond the capacity of immediate manual suppression efforts. A spark landing in stored charcoal, a hot metal fragment falling onto wooden flooring, or an overturned oil lamp could create fires that developed rapidly in the oxygen-rich environment of active forge operations. Fire detection relied entirely on human observation during an era when people were often focused on dangerous work that required complete attention to prevent injuries. Smiths working with red-hot metal and heavy tools couldn't simultaneously monitor for fire development throughout their workshops, especially when smoke from normal forge operations obscured visibility and masked the smell of unwanted fires. The first response to workshop fires usually involved attempts to save valuable tools and materials rather than fighting the fire itself, since experienced smiths understood that blacksmith shop fires typically spread too rapidly to be controlled with available suppression methods. This prioritization of salvage over firefighting often allowed fires to spread beyond the original workshop before organized firefighting efforts began. Water application was often ineffective or counterproductive when dealing with oil-based fires, metal fires, or chemical fires that were common in blacksmith operations. Medieval firefighters didn't understand the different types of fires and appropriate suppression methods, often making fires worse by applying water to oil or chemical fires that spread when mixed with water. Structural collapse occurred rapidly in medieval wooden buildings once fires became established in timber framing members that lost structural integrity when heated beyond critical temperatures. Thatched roofs could burn completely through within 15-20 minutes, while wooden walls and floors failed shortly afterward, creating dangerous conditions for firefighters and making salvage operations extremely hazardous. Fire spread to neighboring buildings was almost inevitable in medieval towns where structures were built close together with shared walls, connected roof lines, and minimal fire breaks between different properties. Sparks and burning debris carried by wind could ignite multiple buildings simultaneously, while radiant heat from intense fires could cause spontaneous ignition in nearby combustible materials. Community firefighting efforts were often chaotic and ineffective due to lack of training, equipment, and coordination among volunteers who responded to fire emergencies without clear leadership or systematic procedures. Bucket brigades could be overwhelmed quickly by intense fires, while confusion about priorities and methods often led to inefficient use of limited water supplies and human resources. Economic losses from blacksmith shop fires extended far beyond the original workshop to include neighboring businesses, residences, and community infrastructure that could be destroyed in the resulting conflagrations. A single blacksmith fire could eliminate years of accumulated wealth and productive capacity, while displacing families and disrupting local economic activities for extended periods. Legal consequences of fire causing included liability for damages to other properties, compensation requirements for displaced families, and potential criminal charges if fires were attributed to negligent practices or violations of local fire prevention ordinances. Medieval legal systems held property owners responsible for fires that spread from their premises, regardless of intent or specific cause. Recovery efforts after major blacksmith fires required rebuilding not just the original workshop, but often entire neighborhoods that had been destroyed in the resulting conflagrations. This rebuilding process could take years and required significant investment of resources that might not be available to affected communities, especially after repeated fire disasters. Insurance concepts didn't exist in medieval times, meaning that fire losses represented complete financial disasters for affected individuals and communities without any systematic risk sharing or compensation mechanisms to help with recovery and rebuilding efforts.
Medieval attempts at fire prevention in blacksmith shops were well-intentioned, but largely ineffective efforts that addressed minor risks while ignoring the fundamental design problems that made these workshops inherently dangerous. The prevention measures that existed were based on limited understanding of fire behavior and available technology that couldn't adequately address the scale of hazards present in forge operations. Building codes, where they existed, focused on minor modifications to construction practices rather than fundamental changes that would significantly reduce fire risks. Some medieval communities required stone foundations or tile roofs for blacksmith shops, but these measures provided limited protection when the majority of building materials remained highly combustible, and forge operations continued to generate extreme heat and spark hazards. Fire watch procedures required smiths to inspect their workshops before leaving at the end of each day, but these inspections were often rushed or superficial and couldn't detect smoldering materials or gradual heating that might develop into fires hours after the workshop was closed. The lack of standardized inspection procedures meant that fire watch quality varied significantly between different smiths. Water storage requirements mandated keeping buckets or barrels of water in blacksmith shops for emergency firefighting, but these small water supplies were inadequate for controlling fires that developed beyond initial stages. The stored water often evaporated, froze in winter, or became contaminated with forge debris, reducing its effectiveness when needed most. Tool and material organization aimed to reduce fire hazards by separating combustible materials from heat sources, but the space limitations and operational requirements of blacksmith work made effective separation difficult to maintain consistently. Economic pressures to maximize workshop efficiency often overrode safety considerations when arranging work areas and storage systems. Guild regulations established standards for forge construction and operational procedures, but enforcement was inconsistent and often more concerned with protecting established smiths from competition than ensuring fire safety. Guild inspections might focus on work quality and pricing compliance while overlooking dangerous fire hazards that could affect entire communities. Community cooperation in fire prevention included agreements about shared firefighting responsibilities and resource pooling, but these arrangements often broke down during actual emergencies when individual survival instincts overrode collective action plans. The lack of professional fire services meant that fire prevention remained dependent on voluntary cooperation that wasn't always reliable. Technology limitations prevented effective implementation of fire prevention measures that might have significantly reduced blacksmith shop fire risks. The absence of non-combustible building materials, effective ventilation systems, and fire suppression technology meant that prevention efforts were essentially attempts to manage inherently dangerous situations rather than eliminate fundamental hazards. Education and training in fire prevention were limited to informal knowledge transfer between experienced and novice smiths without systematic instruction in fire behavior, hazard recognition, or emergency response procedures. This informal training often perpetuated unsafe practices and misconceptions about fire risks that contributed to continued fire problems. Economic incentives often worked against fire prevention, since safety measures required investments in non-productive infrastructure that didn't generate immediate income, while competing smiths might gain competitive advantages by avoiding safety expenditures and offering lower prices. The fundamental contradiction between forge operations and fire safety couldn't be resolved with medieval technology and building materials, making blacksmith shop fires an inevitable consequence of combining extreme heat sources with combustible building materials and storage systems. As we settle into our modern buildings with fire-resistant materials, sprinkler systems, smoke detectors, and professional fire departments, there's something both fascinating and terrifying about medieval blacksmith shops that operated for centuries as neighborhood fire bombs that could destroy entire communities through a single moment of inattention or equipment failure. Tomorrow, when we work in climate-controlled offices with multiple safety systems and regulatory oversight, we can appreciate both our technological progress and the remarkable courage of medieval communities that accepted living next to workshops that regularly burned down, taking half the town with them.
And in the peaceful safety of our modern world, where fire is contained and controlled rather than a constant mortal threat, sleep comes with quiet gratitude for the safety regulations and fire prevention technology that have made dangerous work safer and eliminated the medieval reality where entire neighborhoods lived in constant fear of the next blacksmith fire that would destroy everything they owned in a single afternoon of uncontrollable flames.